essas histórias que são muito interessantes para que a gente entenda como funciona o mercado. E aí eu quero aproveitar, inclusive, que estamos com o Steve aqui disponível para que a gente troque essa ideia e perguntar para ele, já que ele citou esse período a mais do charuto, qual o tempo não vou dizer envelhecimento, mas o tempo assim que ele acha que o charuto, depois de pronto, ele ainda vai aportar os sabores de quando ele foi desenvolvido?
Okay, so as a manufacturer, it should be that when we put the cigar in the box, it should be ready to smoke. And really what ends up happening is during the production part of when we're making cigars, we have to do two opposite things. One, we have to dry the filler materials, the tripa, to make it work on the table. Simultaneously, we have to overwet the binders and wrappers to make them flexible and elastic enough for us to stretch it around the bunch and then for us to finish with the wrapper. So what you do is you have a cigar where the fillers are too dry and the wrapper binder are too wet. And what ends up happening is that moisture that's on the wrapper binder then gets wicked very quickly into the filler, okay? Because the filler then acts as a sponge. And what ends up happening is that cigar basically ends up what I call soupy. It's what other people will call sick, okay? And so when you initially make a cigar on a bench, it typically only tastes the way it should sort of taste almost the day of or the next day. But once you get 3-4 days into it, after it's been freshly made, it almost and particularly with the stronger cigars, the stronger they are, the worse they become. They almost become flavor free because so much moisture ends up being wicked to the center of the barrel of that bunch that all of that moisture deadens the flavor. So the first step after coming off the bench is for us to wick the cigars. And we put them in the cool rooms with the intention of taking out that excess moisture that we had to add and incorporate in order to manufacture it, for that to come back out of the tobacco so that the cigar is actually smokable. Now, if the cigar is a lighter material cigar, Cuban cigars, much thinner, smaller leaves, light materials. If it's a Connecticut shade wrap cigar with milder Dominican and lighter Central American fillers, it typically will only take 3 to 4 weeks for you to wick that moisture out. Now, if it's a heavier cigar, one that has much fuller materials, a lot of sun-grown tripas, Connecticut broadleaf wrapper, a heavy sun-grown Nicaraguan kind of, Corojo or Criollo style wrapper. Those cigars are going to need a minimum of 6 weeks in the cool room, and they may need as much as 12 weeks. Because ultimately, what you want to do is you want to get that cigar down to an absolute moisture content of at least below 13. I personally like to get them down under 12 because I know for the most part, I tend to make a lot of stronger cigars comparatively. So my cigars need a little bit more time. But once you go through that initial wicking process, whether it be 4 weeks for lighter style, 8 to 12 weeks for heavier style, that cigar should be ready to smoke. Now, as a consumer, cigars always do better if they're given a little bit more time. It's like lasagna, right? You have lasagna the day your mother made it. It's great. But boy, if it sits in the fridge for 3 days and all those flavors start to meld and blend, it's really just a lot better, right? And it's no different with cigars. So if you can afford cigars, just an additional 3 to 6 months, almost always universally, they will smoke better. Now, typically, though, what ends up happening is between the time that we pack it, between the time that we import it, the time that it's in the warehouse, by the time it gets to the retailer, most of our cigars, they end up typically having that 6-month period. You'll notice that on all of our boxes, if you turn them over, they're date stamped. And the date on the bottom represents the youngest cigar in the box. Typically, the cigars in the box are often 2 months older. But the problem is that when you go to the color sorting table, you lose track of what cigar came from what half wheel. And you have them all on the table. So we always use the date of the youngest half wheel, even if there's only one half wheel amongst 30 half wheels that we're color sorting that day. That ends up being the date that ends up on the bottom of the box But the reality is, in almost every one of our boxes, the cigars are about 2 months older on average than what the bottom date stamp even represents. I think that that's a good point. Now, as far as long-term aging, that's a question of what a consumer wants out of a cigar. I mean, if you want a cigar that's smoother and rounder, then, if you take a heavy blend and you set it aside for 2-3 years, you're going to achieve that. You're going to achieve even more of that in 5 or 6 years. But it's a lot like a red wine. There's a point where it no longer gets better, and then eventually it peaks, and then it starts to slowly fade away and degrade. Because the longer you store that cigar, you're just eventually getting more of the essential oils that are in the tobacco are eventually being evaporated out of that tobacco. So it's a very individual, personal thing. I find that I enjoy most cigars if I afford them an extra year. An extra year to me seems to be ideal, but I can't ask the consumer to do that. They're not expected to do that unless you're Cubans. The Cubans, they've managed to make it to where, yeah, we're selling you something that isn't good to smoke now. Smoke it in a year or two and it'll be much better. That approach would never work with the U.S. consumer. We're just way too in the moment. We would be very dissatisfied. But I think that most cigars do tend to do better with an additional year of aging on them. And the heavier blends will tend to age better long-term and will not deteriorate as quickly as the milder blends. The milder blends, very seldom do you have a mild blend that once you get beyond a year or two, there's really any improvement in any way whatsoever, regardless of what you and your personal tastes are. Heavier blends, though, like the Ligas that I have in my inventory, somebody else may just think these are the best cigars they've ever smoked. They just don't give me the experience that I want out of them anymore. So for me, they're overaged at this point. So it's relative. But yes, cigars when they go in a box should be ready to smoke.